Joining us today, Victory News contributors John Graves of MillionVoices.org, and a little while KrisAnne Hall, KrisAnneHall.com. Let's get started with today's stories with our friend Mike Garofalo. Mike?
And Greg, on Tuesday here on Victory News, we told you about congressional Democrats setting their sights on Fox News, Newsmax, One America News, accusing them of spreading disinformation and extremism. Well, here is a look at yesterday's hearing by the Democrat-led Communications and Technology Subcommittee. They called it fanning the flames, disinformation and extremism in the media. Let's begin with ranking minority member Republican Cathy McMorris Rodgers of Washington State. She began by objecting to the hearing and called the letter by the subcommittee Democrat leaders one-sided and an affront to the free press.
Well, where does it end? We've already seen liberal ideology pushed in our schools, where we work, the books we read, who we communicate with, how we practice our faith. It's frightening. And you know what the worst part is? People are afraid of a woke and authoritarian system that is getting them fired, canceled, and shamed. And so they're being silent. They have no voice. They can't trust the broken institutions to protect them. This culture of fear is unjust.
A number of expert witnesses were called to testify. The first was former MSNBC anchor Soledad O'Brien.
And when news organizations make decisions based on ratings rather than responsible reporting, disinformation flourishes in dangerous ways. Important conversations are clouded, scrutiny is reduced, trust in our institution erodes. So what to do about all this? Let me be clear that Congress cannot and should not regulate journalism in defiance of the First Amendment. But here's what we can do. Don't book liars or advance lies. Cover the fact that lies and propaganda are being disseminated, but do not book people to lie on your show because it elevates them and presents a lie as another side.
Greg, as President Joe Biden and his Democrat allies in Congress attempt to once again punch through the Equality Act, conservative leaders are calling to protect America's children from the burden of gender identity and sexual orientation politics. The Promise to America's Children initiative would protect children and parents who want to raise their kids with Christian views on gender, sexuality, abortion, and life, and to keep them from being forced to comply with government policies that penalize them for not doing so. The Equality Act is billed as a law that would prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation, and for other purposes. But according to the Heritage Foundation, the bill would likely cause harm to employers and workers by threatening them with penalties if they do not conform with the new sexual norms. At least 24 state legislators have signed the pledge. Now, according to the movement's website, that's what we've learned. And after warnings from Christian leaders about the damage to society as we know it that the Equality Act would do, the measure is expected to come up for a vote in the House today. Now, according to the Washington Examiner, things already started to get heated about H.R. 5 on Wednesday on the House floor when a voice vote was called to begin debate. Right off the bat, Georgia Republican Marjorie Taylor Greene tried to delay today's vote by calling for an adjournment vote. Well, it failed. 202 voted for it, 214 voted against that. The Equality Act was last passed by the House in 2019, but it never came up for a vote in the then Republican-controlled Senate. Initially, the bill appears to be piggybacking off the 1964 Civil Rights Act by banning discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, but it does a whole lot more than that. As the Examiner reports, the bill specifically says it supersedes, and listen to this, it supersedes the 1993 Religious Freedom Restoration Act. That law sets the standard for the government to defend laws if people claim their religious freedom has been infringed upon. Greg, back to you.
Wow, so many things that affect the body of Christ here. I want to bring in KrisAnne Hall, Victory News contributor. I want to ask you then about this Equality Act. We're adding something here to the Civil Rights Act. Is it the same thing, or is that an insult to civil rights that we know of the 60s?
Well, what's very interesting is first to recognize that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 establishes an exemption for religious organizations and churches for hiring and firing practices. So this being inserted into amending the Civil Rights Act would not override that exemption, But what we really need to be concerned about is the insertion of this into the Civil Rights Action, combined with the fact that now the courts feel that they have the authority to define for the church who is a religious worker and who is not. So it's the combination of the courts redefining for the churches who are clergy, who are religious employees, and who are not. That is the real concern here. And when the courts start defining who is a religious actor in the church, who is clergy in the church, now we have government literally defining religion. And it's the combination of these two things that are very dangerous to religious liberty.
Yeah, our founding fathers were very much against this. Thank you so much for your insight.
Well, President Joe Biden signed an executive order Wednesday intended to boost manufacturing jobs. He wants to do so by strengthening U.S. supply chains for advanced batteries, pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, and semiconductors.
The American people should never face shortages in the goods and services they rely on, whether that's their car or the prescription medicines or the food at the local grocery store. And remember, the shortages in PPE during the pandemic, that meant we didn't have masks. We didn't have gowns or gloves to protect our frontline healthcare workers.
The United States has become increasingly reliant on the import of these goods, a potential national security and economic risk that the Biden administration hopes to address with the planned 100-day review. Greg, back to you.
All right, I want to bring John Graves in here. You know, as I'm remembering this, I remember President Trump turning industry on, say, guys, make us ventilators, make us masks. And I remember him doing that. Is my memory fading or something there?
No, you correctly remember it that way. It's just funny. Every one of these stories is kind of how people choose to reinterpret things or believe something, and they even pick on it. I want to go back to something you said earlier about the Equality Act. Notice that the first line of defense in all these leftist agenda is in the language. They call them Equality Act or Anti-Discrimination Act. Therefore, if you're against it, you're a discriminator. And you brought up something that I think most people miss. The Civil Rights Act is based on the color of your skin. You're born with brown or black skin. Gender now, you can just choose to do it and change it every single day. And so they're lumping that in. It should be an insult to any person of color who has experienced genuine discrimination based on the color of their skin to now have everybody else can say, I can have all those rights and more just by my choice or just changing my opinion day to day.
Very keen observation. I recognize that and I thought, that doesn't sound right. Let's look at a couple of stories from Georgia. The phrase sanctuary state will take on new meaning after the latest announcement from Georgia Governor Brian Kemp. The new law, called the Faith Protection Act, would prevent the wholesale shutdown of churches in the event of another pandemic-like scenario. The law follows a tumultuous year for the governor after a state's election practices were under the microscope during the presidential election and the senatorial election, and after his actions during the pandemic left liquor stores and marijuana dispensaries open but closed all churches and houses of worship. When speaking about the new law, Kemp said he wants Georgia to be known as a sanctuary state for people of faith, and that the new law will ensure the emergency powers of any governor of Georgia in the years to come are not used to limit the God-given right to worship. Staying in Georgia, lawmakers there seem to be taking steps to ensure the election integrity after a messy effort in 2020. On Tuesday, the Senate approved a measure requiring more identification for absentee voting. Senate Bill 67 calls for voters to show some kind of ID, such as a driver's license, a state ID number, or a copy of a photo ID when requesting the absentee ballot. The measure reportedly has strong support from the General Assembly's Republican majority. Democrats, of course, oppose this, saying that showing an ID would impose a burden on voters. John, let me bring you in on this. That seems like a step in the right direction. Am I wrong?
No, you're exactly right. It's a step in the right direction, but the irony is it's a 180-degree correction for the governor, who's in a lot of trouble over the election fraud, just like the new law that says, oh, I know we violated it last time in the election, but now that Trump's out, let's change the rules and get back to it. Kemp's in a lot of trouble in that state with people who supported the prior president. And so he's trying, it's a smart move politically, but notice what happens. It's the same thing Senator Graham said of McConnell. If you don't get on board with the people who are behind a president that was trying to actually get something done against both establishment swamps, if you will, then you're going to be in real trouble. This is a smart move by Kemp to try to move back into the faith community. I don't know if that'll be enough to overcome the other problems, but we'll see soon enough.
KrisAnne, they're going to be a sanctuary city, and then they also now, I'm liking seeing states, when the Supreme Court refused to hear any more of these cases, now the states are taking action. That's the way it's supposed to be, isn't it?
Absolutely. Our states have the ultimate authority to and the ultimate duty to defend the rights of the people when the federal government is overreaching its bounds. This is something that should happen also if the Equality Act is passed. The states just a religious sanctuary to shutting down the states because of the churches because of the pandemic. They should also establish a law that says we're not going to comply with anything that imposes undue regulation on our churches regarding hiring practices or worshiping practices or anything like that. We never delegated any authority to the federal government to be involved in these things through our Constitution. And therefore, any act by the federal government trying to impose power on our states regarding these issues is null and void, according to Article 6, Clause 2 of the Constitution. And our states can and should and must take a stand to defend the rights of the people from overreaching federal regulation.
So true. Thank you for being with us today. John Graves, 20 seconds to you. Your thoughts?
I would agree with KrisAnne, and I would quote this scripture, "The weeping may last for the night, joy comes in the morning." Do not give up when things look really dark and bad. Keep praying. We're starting to see signs of hope that some of these states and some of these people, and hopefully even people who are on the wrong side of issues, are now coming back to issues of faith.
That's absolutely true. Thank you both for being with us today and the insight that you bring to the people of God every single time you're on. I truly appreciate it.